Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Blueforce Payroll Pitfalls webinar. This webinar obviously is part of our Mastering Blueforce weekly series, and this one is for the week of March the 13th. As we do with all of our sessions, all of our attendees right now are currently muted. So if you do us a favor, if you have any questions, any concerns during today's webinar, please go ahead and ask those questions in the little questions area of the control panel, and I'll be happy to address them at the appropriate time. Now, our webinar obviously is part of our series that we're offering every Tuesday and Thursday. So as a reminder, sign up for one of those sessions and join us at 2 p.m. Central, either Tuesday or Thursday. And all of our webinars are recorded. So as we go through today's session, as all of our prior webinars, you can be reviewed later at a later date again, or a refresher can be seen out there on YouTube or on the Gateway site. Obviously, as well, all of our documentation and stuff as related to these webinars is posted out on Gateway as well, along with another site called Google Drive, in which I actually have all of our documentation posted for your review there as well. Now, as part of this documentation, I went ahead and put the links into this session, so when you download it, you can actually have the links at your disposal as well. So as we mentioned, as you saw your ePay update from Monday, our session today is going to be surrounding Blueforce and what I refer to as Payroll Pitfalls. Now, the Payroll Pitfalls will refer to these different core areas as we look at daily time review, things you can avoid when you're doing your daily time review. Pitfalls also as it relates to the edits, time card versus timesheet. We'll talk about pitfalls in handling pay rate increases and or pay group changes. That's a big topic. And then we'll also wrap it up with pitfalls as it relates to reprocessing timesheets and overtime settings in Blueforce. So a lot to cover, so let's get started. I'd like to start today's session with just a general question. I've used the term pitfall quite a bit already as we get going, but what exactly is a pitfall is the question of the moment. So what a pitfall is, as defined, is basically a hidden or not easily recognized danger or difficulty. What I basically summed up, are basically things that we want to avoid when doing our Blueforce payroll. So when we're using Blueforce and looking at our time punches and get ready for payroll, these are things we want to avoid. That's kind of our focus today on this webinar. So our first pitfalls that we're going to be talking about deal around daily time review. Now, as everyone knows, daily time review is encouraged and strongly suggested as being as part of our daily process to go and make sure that our employees are punching in and punching out the night before, and we actually have corrected any open punches or invalid punch issues have been addressed, etc. So daily time review is a big core part of our day-to-day routine. Now, as far as the pitfall as it relates to daily time review, it's really just the delay of reviewing time. That's kind of a quick, easy pitfall to review real quick, because obviously if we don't do our daily time review or we delay it, we're going to incur other issues down the road. So basically, don't run from it, just do it. The longer you wait, the better chance you forget to go back and basically go and add a punch for any employees, or maybe go inquire about a invalid punch an employee had, or something along those lines that would ultimately affect your compliance scoring. So when you talk about daily time review, the key criteria to keep in mind, and for this very short pitfall topic here, is just basically remember by next business day, we want to actually have your daily time reviewed. We want to make sure we clear up any open punches and clear up any of those invalid punches. And as a quick review, invalid punches are those punches in which an employee had an issue with a fingerprint for the time clocks, or called from a unauthorized or unregistered phone number for phone-in, etc. Or, mobile punch users, those are the ones that maybe have clocked in or out to that job site outside of that acceptable range. So a couple of different scenarios for invalid punches. But bottom line, we want to ensure that the employee's labor is coded to the correct job, task, and or work order, because those monthly labor forecast reports that we have from our management reporting are greatly affected as well. So real quick, our first pitfall is daily time reviewed, and basically that pitfall we want to stay away from is delaying that review of time. We want to actually delay. We do not want to delay. We actually want to go through and review it in a timely manner. that was a quick, easy one to get started. Let's go into our next topic, which is making edits as it relates to time cards versus timesheets. Now, this is actually obviously a topic we've reviewed a couple of times in the past, but I want to take a different approach this time around and actually addressing one key pitfall that people are, our Blueforce users around the country are actually doing. And the pitfall here in when making edits is making time edits in the timesheet view. Now, one of the things that we've always mentioned is, there is a difference between time cards and timesheets, but whenever you're making any time edits as it relates to worked hours, you do not do those in the timesheet view. You do them actually on the time card view. And here's the big difference between the two, and I'll explain more reasons as to why you always do it in the time card view for any working related hours. And that's basically because the time card screen is going to always reflect the employee's raw punches. And when they work, we ask them, and obviously we require all of our employees to punch in and punch out. That time goes straight to the time card view. Now, the time card view, just keep in mind, does not include any rules, doesn't include any overtime, doesn't include any shift or pay differentials, doesn't include any automatically deducted lunch, doesn't include any union rules or anything like that. It's truly the raw time. If the employee punched in at 4:02 p.m., then it's going to show 4:02 p.m. as the clock-in time on the time card screen. That same employee clocked out at 11:53 p.m., then 11:53 p.m. is going to be on the out punch. But bottom line, on the time card side, that is strictly for adding or changing any worked hours. Hours worked only on the time cards. Now, on the timesheet side, keep in mind, the way Blueforce works is as the employee has punched in over on the time card side, and as the employee gets a corresponding paired punch or a corresponding out punch to pair up the in and out together, the system will then send that line of time over to the timesheet view, to which then you can actually see the time there in the timesheet view. But keep in mind, the timesheet view always reflects the time after system calculations. What that basically means is now you have overtime, you have pay differentials, you have lunch rules, union rules, pay rules, you name it. Everything's been applied to that time you see in the timesheet view. So really, the timesheet view is what you intend to pay the employee when it comes to payroll time, and in essence, what they're going to get paid for that particular day. So time card would show 8 hours. Timesheet would probably show 7.5. Because 7.5 hours would be that 30-minute lunch deducted automatically deducted for that employee. Now, time cards also is the place where you go and add or change any non-worked hours. So keep in mind the theme here: worked hours in time cards, non-worked hours in timesheets. Now, non-worked hours can be anything that's related as far as PTO-related rate types. For example, sick, vacation, holiday, non-work, bereavement, jury duty. Some of you have birthday and anniversary pay, a couple of different things like that that are entered in the system that are non-worked. Now keep in mind, when I say you can enter time that's considered non-worked PTO time into the system, if you do it via the timesheet view and you're using one of those PTO-related rate types, then you're not going to be deducted or counted against or anything like that on your compliance scores, because non-worked hours are not part of our calculations. And a little bit more on that here momentarily. But bottom line, non-work scenarios should always be in the timesheet view. The other scenario that can be put into the timesheet view is the scenario of manual job entry. So if an employee forgets to punch in or punch out, those are still going to be worked hours on the time card side. That's still the same. But the manual job hours I'm talking about here are those scenarios where employees do not have a means to punch in or punch out at the job site. So the job site cannot have phone in, does not have a time clock, doesn't have Wi-Fi capabilities to do, or cellular capabilities to do the mobile punch, etc. So the only true way of treating that job is as a manual job, meaning that all the time for that job would always be manually entered in the system. Now, as I've talked about in previous webinars, those are allowed. There are very select situations around the country that allow for these jobs, and currently, just kind of give you an insight on manual jobs. We're probably about 75, 80 maybe or so manual jobs around the country. So you can see it's a very select group. So not just anyone can get into this little club per se, but the manual job entry consists of just going to the timesheet and putting in number of hours per day for those employees. So once again, timesheets typically are only for non-worked entry, non-worked hours being entered there, or manual job hours being entered there. So continuing kind of with the same pitfall, just keep in mind that when a timesheet view, and you go to the timesheet view and you actually check it out, the timesheet view is always going to show you, like I said, that work time summarized. Okay? So think about this. If you're going and looking at work time summarized, and it has all the rules applied to it, what's going to happen, this is going to open a question back to you guys to think about, is if it shows 7.5 hours when we know the employee actually worked for 8, and I go and try to tweak those hours on the timesheet view, what hours am I actually tweaking, the 8 or the 7.5 that's showing there? And keep in mind, if the rules have already been applied in the system, then the system's going to do its darnest to keep trying to rectify those hours and make sure those rules are being applied appropriately. So if I going back to the initial question, if I go back to that timesheet and I show 7.5 hours there, and I'm trying to, add hours to it or trying to manipulate those hours, the hours that I'm manipulating are those 7.5 hours, not the original 8 that employee worked, because once again, the system is running and trying to make sure that those rules that we've told the system already that we're going to apply at certain conditions are met. So what that actually ultimately happens is by you trying to edit time in that timesheet view, that's going to create some type of havoc and distress that a lot of us have encountered, I guess you say, indirectly by trying and not knowing otherwise. So once again, the reason that's occurring is because the system is trying to continue to enforce those system rules that we have in place. And it turns out to be a big messy game of tug of war. And it's kind of, I'll illustrate down here at the bottom of our slide. It becomes a very messy game because now the system is going to say, you know what, you've told me to take out 30 minutes already, so I'm already taking out 30 minutes. But if you want to add time to it, I'll add some time to it, but I'm going to still take away 30 minutes. So those 8 hours of originally worked time, like I said, is shown in the 7.5 hours in the timesheet view. And if I continue to try to edit that 7.5 to make it 8, the system will say, right, you know what, I'm going to let you go ahead and add that 8, those 30 minutes back, but I'm going to take them right back because my rule says I need to go ahead and rectify, make sure I have a lunch rule in play. So it becomes very messy to try to do all that stuff because the system knows that the employee already punched in for 8. So keep in mind that if you ever have to make any edits to work time or have to do anything related to work time, that has to be all done over in the time card view. Now, when you're entering any hours directly into the timesheet, like PTO hours or more so non-work scenarios, or just any hours period directly into the timesheet. Keep in mind that the hours are entered by day. We only want non-worked hours, for example, the PTO-related type hours, entered into the timesheet view. Or like I said earlier, fully 100% manual job hours only. But the hours should always be entered with any lunch deductions or shift differentials in mind. So if you want the employee at the end of the day to actually get paid for those 8 hours of vacation, you want to make sure it shows 8 hours of vacation in the timesheet view. If you are dealing with manual job hours, and you're entering those in the timesheet view, and you want that employee to get paid 6.5 hours because he typically works 7, but he has a 30-minute lunch taken out, then you want to key in 6.5 hours directly into the timesheet. Now, the timesheet is a pretty smart tool there that we have at our disposal. However, if there's nothing feeding it from the time card view or any other rules associated to it before you get to your manual entry, then the system is going to be dumb at that point, and that you'll have to tell it what exactly you intend to pay. So if the employee is working an 8-hour shift, for example, at one of these 100% manual jobs, then you're going to want to include a half-hour lunch, and you're going to make sure that you're going to enter just 7.5 in the timesheet view. Now, keep in mind that whenever you do any non-work PTO-related hours or any manual job hours into the timesheet view, the system is always, and system being Blueforce here, It's always going to try to keep everything in balance. So what I mean by that, it's going to try to keep the timesheet view in balance with the time card view. So the first scenario that I showed about worked hours, I talked about how the time accumulated and basically came into the time card view, and then it kind of spit over into the timesheet side, and where it actually summarized and applied any rules and all that good stuff. Well, when you do any non-work PTO related hours or any entry directly into the timesheet view, the system says, I got to rectify, or actually I got to keep both sides in balance. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to send back a timesheet back to the. I'm going to create a time card for you back on the time card section. So what's going to happen here is the system says, all right, well, you put in 7.5 hours for me in timesheet view for this employee. Now I got to make sure that you have a corresponding in and out punch over in the time card view. So some of you may have noticed that you've gone in there and you'll see that an employee has some weird times that have been created for them, but then you realize, oh, that's because I entered some manual time over into the timesheet view. Or, you know, for example, an employee shows to have a punch of midnight to 8 a.m. for 8 hours of vacation when I keyed that time over in the timesheet view. Why did that occur? Once again, the system is trying to keep both sides in balance, and it's creating that time punch over in the time card screen based on the employee's default shift and task, or depending on based on the employee's existing punch for that day. So what that's basically saying is, if I have a vacation entry for this employee, the system's going to go to that job. It's going to look into that particular employee's default shift and task as it relates to that job, and it's going to put a corresponding punch starting with the starting time of that shift under that default shift and task tab. So that default shift for that employee is, for example, 7 a.m. to 3 p.m. And that employee, you know, doesn't typically work that shift, but he typically works 4 p.m. to, say, midnight. What's going to happen is, although the employee works a different shift, that's perfectly fine. That default shift is nothing more than a label. It's just a label that's out there in the system to kind of help group like employees. But what the system is going to do is going to try to keep both sides in balance once again. It's going to say, I put 8 hours in for the timesheet. The system's going to return it with a 8-hour long punch starting at 7 a.m. because that's the default shift start for this particular employee, going for 8 hours. So in the time card view, you'll probably see a vacation entry there for 7 a.m. Until 3 p.m. That'll give you your 8 hours, and obviously the employee has no deduction or anything on it, so the employee would sit at 8 hours at that point. So that is a question that we get quite often is, why am I seeing these, I hate to say the word phantom, but phantom punches over in the time card view. I didn't create those. Well, indirectly you did. It's because the system is trying to keep both sides in balance. So that's our second pitfall. That's making time edits in the timesheet view. So once again, to sum this up, worked time should always be edited in the time card screen, and non-worked hours, or those 100% manual job hours, those should be done in the timesheet view. All right, so the next topic, and the next pitfall, the next pitfalls, there are a couple in here, relate to the next topic of handling pay rate increases and or pay group changes. Now, I bring this one up because all of us at some time or another have at some point were affected in some way, shape, form by a pay rate increase for an employee, or affected by a pay group change of some sort as it relates to one of our employees. So the first one I want to talk about, and that's kind of all of us there at some time and not covering our faces, because our first pitfall there involves pay rate increases made in JDE after the fact. Now, it's no secret that all of us at some point or another have forgotten to put in a pay rate for an employee, or maybe the paperwork didn't get in on time, whatever it may be, the PTF, and an employee's already on the clock and working this week, and now we need to make sure that they get the right pay rate for all those hours. So one thing to keep in mind is all pay rates are updated every 30 minutes via interface that sends those pay rates from JD Edwards over into Blueforce. Okay, that's a standard interface that we have running every 30 minutes. And really what that amounts to is at the very top of the hour and the bottom of the hour. So at 2 p.m., 2:30 p.m., 3 p.m., 3:30, 4, 4:30, etc. Now, Blueforce applies the new pay rate on a going forward basis, meaning that the new rate will only appear on the time collected from that point forward. So we have an effective date in the system that in JD Edwards that all the pay rates are based on. But if we've passed that effective date, the system then says, well, I can't go back to that particular date. Well, I can go back, but for sake of messing up any information in the system, I'm going to go ahead and just take that rate from that time going forward. So from the time it hits Blueforce going forward is how that pay rate works on the Blueforce side. So keep in mind, if for some reason I needed a pay rate to go in effect this past Saturday, but I didn't get to it till today and got it entered in JD Edwards this morning and now it's synced up over into Blueforce, the next time the employee punches in, the system will then take the new rate and apply it going forward. But that time that's already in there from Saturday to Thursday today will need to be, corrected. So the way you correct that is through a process called reprocessing timesheets. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail momentarily, but to hold that thought. But this process allows you to go back and the system really goes in and rectifies and makes sure that everything is perfectly fine for that employee. The system is checking a couple of things, make sure all the payrolls are applied correctly, make sure all the pay rates are pulled in, and then gives you updated information. However, if you do not reprocess the timesheets on your own, the system will not automatically update those pay rates. So I think one of the themes, I guess, of this section is, and you've noticed that you may have had a pay rate that fell in that scenario where it was already after the start of the pay week and employees already on the clock for that pay week. Well, come payroll time, they got their check stubs, they checked their check stubs or checked their bank statements, whatever it may be, and noticed that they were shorted some money. And that is the reason why. It's because no one went back in there to reprocess timesheets. So I'm going to talk about that in a little more detail a little bit later in a special section for that, but I want to go ahead and bring your attention now to that. So as you go through there, just keep in mind that it's strongly suggested that any pay rate changes get requested in advance, and they do not get applied prior to the effective date. So like I mentioned, if we know the effective date of a pay change is going to be, for example, April the 1st, right now is the time that you should be on it to get these pay rates ready to go. And once they're in the system, and once they're in JD Edwards with an April 1st effective date, those will actually sync over to Blueforce, but Blueforce will not allow the system, will not allow itself to pull in any new rates until that effective date of April the 1st. So in that case, you have basically a rate that's sitting in the queue, waiting to be applied, just waiting and waiting and waiting until April the 1st appears, and then when that employee punches in, the employee would automatically get that new correct rate. And there will be no need for reprocessing timesheets or going back later and forgetting to pay an employee. So it is strongly suggested you queue those up in advance. Now, pay rate changes going through JDE, and then they actually go into Blueforce via the interface. Keep in mind, it's a little process we have going. Everything goes through the system of record, which is JD Edwards. Everything starts in JD Edwards, and everything ultimately finishes off in JD Edwards. So go to JDE first, and then within that 30-minute window, it'll be shot over into Blueforce. The second pitfall, that was the pitfall as it relates to pay rates. The other pitfall we often get into deals with pay groups. Now, pay groups are nothing more than groups of, I would say, different groups of different rules, situations that affect a certain group of employees. So a pay group is just a grouping of employees with like rules, and we use rules, like I said, were lunch rules or OT rules or more so union rules, and more than anything. So the pitfall as it relates to pay groups is not hiring employees into the correct pay group. And many of you have that same look on that guy's face, covering it up, because this happened to a lot of us as well. So keep in mind that pay groups are also updated every 30 minutes via an interface. But the only catch to a pay group that's different from a pay rate is the pay groups do not update, every 30 minutes automatically or via that process called reprocessing timesheets. Pay groups only get applied at the start of a new pay week. Now, pay groups, as I mentioned, deal with rules, how overtime is calculated, how certain union rules get applied, etc. So they're a little bit bigger and more powerful settings. So that's the reason why they only get applied at the start of a new pay week, which is Saturday morning. Now, if there is a need, and say we hire someone to the wrong pay group, or for some reason the employee is just set up incorrectly, we can always help you. We, as being us on the ITE pay team, we can come through and help you by changing that employee over to the correct pay group. Now, we can do that at any point, but we ask that you put in this emergency help desk request so we can get going and get that going and be notified of the change needed and get that started for you. But bottom line, the pay groups control a lot of things, and the main thing it controls, it governs over those OT rules that I've been referring to. So the system knows this employee works 40 hours, they get entitled to 40 overtime after 40 hours. Or this group over here is in the New York area, they work on an 8-hour daily rule, which basically means they get overtime after 8 hours in a day. Or go over here, this union has a unique rule. This union says that by union contract, they get overtime after 37 hours, and we have a few like to do that. So those pay groups, it's essential that the employee is correct from day one. So for all of you on this call, have the responsibility to keep an eye on that, because it affects the employee's pay potentially. Obviously, there's other government rules that we have to follow that could be greatly affected as well. So part of this pitfall is just pay attention. Be familiar with your employees and where they should be assigned to. Now, pay groups, like I mentioned, they drive the rules for the employees, and I can't say that enough. It governs OT, union versus non-union. So we have some pay groups that start with a U. There are some that start with the letter N. That kind of determines union versus non-union. I'll explain a little bit more about that here momentarily. Holiday rules. Some pay groups have holiday rules where we have certain holidays to be paid a certain way because this group of employees do a union contract or otherwise get supposed to get paid that way. Or just generally any other type of pay rules. Everything goes off of that pay group. So anything you can think of on how an employee should get paid, or how rules should be applied to their time worked, is part of a pay group. So as you can see here in this particular screenshot, everyone who has access to the timesheet view, which is all of our editors, submitters, and approvers on this phone call, you all have access to the timesheet view, and every one of you can actually go to the timesheet view and actually see the different groupings that are available on your job timesheet. So this example, I pull up a job over in the Houston office, and this job actually is for 1800 West Loop South. And if I will go ahead and click on that option that says groups, and oops, sorry about that. Let me back up. Sorry, right here. So if I go back over here and actually click on the little grouping, and that little grouping that says group right now is 02250310. That little grouping indicator, if I go and click on it, it's going to expand and show me the two groups, pay groups, that make up that bigger group. Now that grouping that's there is just to kind of keep everything in tidy, so you can kind of see all the employees, all the different pay groups that are affecting your payroll for that particular job timesheet. Now in this case, you'll see that there are two pay groups. One's N-104-US-B1, and the other one is U-104-SEIU-1-B1. And most of the time, most of us on this phone call will get that, see those pay group names and say, what was corporate thinking when they created those pay group names? Those names are crazy. They're hard to remember. We've heard it all. But here's the method to the madness here. So the first letter of the pay group, just so everyone knows and familiar with, the N versus the U, the difference between there is just simply union versus non-union. So anyone that's in the U pay group is a union employee. Now, if you notice a union employee does not have a pay group with the letter U at the beginning of it, then you need to address it, because we need to make sure they are in the right pay group. Obviously, when we talk about union rules and other things going in the unions, there's a lot of factors that need to be calculated correctly, because we want to make sure the union is, first of all, the employee is treated as a union employee and not otherwise. The next three letters or digits in this case are going to be the number of your company. So company 104 is Houston. Company 301 is New York. Company 402 is Kansas City. Company 457 is the Bay Area and San Francisco, etc. So you've got a couple different company numbers that will be available there. So those pay groups will identify now union, company, and then the next couple characters are typically, if it's a union pay group, you'll have the name of the union or part of the name of the union involved in there. In this case, part of the union is SEIU for this particular union group, pay group. And then lastly, you at the last designation, typically we'll see a W, a B1, or a B2. If you see a W, that means that you are in a weekly pay group. That means that if this first particular last example was a U-104-SEIU-W, that would tell me that that union group for Houston is on a weekly basis, meaning every week I should, as a payroll person, I should be watching and making sure that this process is on a weekly basis. If it's a B1, that means you are in the first cycle of a biweekly period for the month. B2 would be you're on the second cycle of a weekly, say biweekly pay period, biweekly payroll each month. So those kind of give you a little insight what the different pieces of that puzzle are. A lot of us, in some cases, if you're in a company or an area here in the state of Texas, minus Houston here, you're typically going to have just one pay group. Like the San Antonio group that's on the phone today, you may only have one, which is going to be N-103-US- I think B1 for you guys. But regardless, you just probably have one. Whereas up in New York or some of the sites where we have a union, in Kansas City, out in California, you may have multiple to choose from. So just keep in mind and keep your eyes wide open on that, because it can make a difference on the employee being in the right group and being processed at the right time versus just being paid correctly. So I'm going to go take a step back and go in a little bit more depth about this reprocessing timesheets. And kind of talking about that pitfall that we get to on the pay rate side, as the pitfall simply is that we wait too long to process that pay rate change, and affects obviously the delay in getting that pay rate to show up in a timely manner over on the employee's timesheet. So as it relates to reprocessing timesheets, the real pitfall that we get into as it relates to reprocessing timesheets is that we simply don't reprocess changes. So that basically means is we don't do the process changes. So as I mentioned, as the system is collecting your in and out punches for the employee, the system is applying those rules and running those rules through its own reprocessing timesheet process. However, if those pay rules, pay rates, union rules, etc. change during a pay period, you can run that reprocessing timesheet at any point to have that system automatically update. And when it does that, the process here called reprocessing timesheet just basically goes out, ensures that the employee has the most recent pay rate and the most recent pay rules are in play. So basically all that does is it just ensures that everything is being accurately calculated for that employee. And if we forget and fail to run this reprocessing timesheet process, it could create a short pay situation. So submitters and approvers on this phone call, it doesn't hurt you to rerun or run this reprocessing timesheet process as part of your final checks before you submit and before you approve payroll. So I always suggest that everyone does it. It doesn't hurt you to take that extra second or two, because it's going to save you a lot of time and grief later, and obviously save your employees some short pays as well in the long run. So when it comes to this reprocessing timesheets, at the bottom right-hand corner of every timesheet, actually it's not the bottom right corner, at the very far right-hand side, of the timesheet, each job timesheet has this link called Request Reprocessing. You typically don't see it on your screen, and often you have to scroll to the right to see it. But when you do scroll over, you are able to click on that link, and when you do that, you're going to be prompted with 3 options, and these 3 options are shown here on the right-hand side of the screen. Now, the first option is reprocesses only open punches. So what I typically do is I say I'm going to scratch that out. I don't want to do that, because if I only reprocess open punches, it's only going to affect those punches that are out there currently. It's not going to affect anything else. It's just going to look at the open punches. So it's not a bad thing, but typically I say avoid that one. And then the last one says refresh only rates. So that basically means it's only going to go out there and update your pay rates. So I'm going to look at any other pay rules, any lunch rules, union rules, shift differential rules, etc. It's just going to look at pay rates. So the one we want is that middle one, reprocess all employees. And what that does, the system once again goes out, looks at all your employees that have worked that job timesheet, goes out there and first pulls in all the updated rates for them, make sure all the rates are correct, make sure all their payrolls are correct, make sure all the OT rules are correct, then goes through and says any union setups, any rules like that that are pared down, looks at those, applies those adequately, and then goes into the job record and looks at all the shift differential rules, any payrolls that we have as far as the shift is concerned, or the shift differentials are set up, and applies those accordingly as well. And then finally returns an update where then you can hopefully see a change in the employee's record or the job timesheet, and actually see an increase in pay or decrease depending on what the rules were, and everything is now in order and accurate, so you can actually complete the process by now submitting your timesheet and ultimately approving the timesheet for payroll. So it doesn't hurt to take an extra 2-3 seconds to go in here and click on Request Reprocessing, and then clicking Reprocess All Employees, and then coming to the bottom and then clicking on Save. So that's kind of the reprocessing timesheets, a very simple process. Everyone on this phone call has access to doing that. And the best thing about it all, it doesn't hurt the record, it doesn't hurt the system if you run it 1 time or if you run it 100 times. That process, the links there are always there for you to be used just as a one last check before you submit it and approve this timesheet. All right, and then our going into kind of one of the last sections of our call today is overtime settings. And overtime settings, and we talk about overtime all the time, and we talk about how we obviously don't want overtime unless we really have to, but we do understand there are overtime situations because we have employees who obviously call in, or we're a little short-staffed here and there, and we have to have other employees help fill in those gaps, in essence, then creating overtime situations. So as we talk about overtime, we have situations where we have some pitfalls we fall into where we try to force overtime. We try to go in there and assign time to our time to overtime, which is not the proper way of doing it, but I'll explain that a little bit momentarily. We have pitfalls involving some of our system settings and how it's calculating overtime, and ultimately at the end of the day how it affects us, because sometimes we inadvertently change rate types to overtime, and then we realize the employee didn't actually work overtime at the end of the pay week, and those hours that we had already deemed as overtime at the beginning of the pay period are still going to get paid at time and a half when that employee probably shouldn't have been getting overtime. There are a lot of things we can talk about when it talks to overtime, and we'll go through a couple of those scenarios here. The first pitfall is going to be around forcing overtime. So the first thing is the pitfall there is changing the rate type to overtime. Now, we do understand, like I mentioned, that employees do need to be given overtime. Often we want certain jobs to have the overtime because we don't want to be hit on other jobs because we can't afford it, or it's simply not budgeted for overtime. So the first thing when we talk about this, just keep in mind, we never want to change the rate to overtime. So if an employee is due overtime, there is an alternative I'll talk to you here momentarily about, but never use a rate type called overtime. Now that overtime rate is only going to be used by the system. It's only going to be used by Blueforce when calculating overtime. That way we know that whenever we see overtime, the overtime rate, or the code 150 in the system in the background, that is strictly related to time that the system has generated on its own. It's not something that a user has changed otherwise. So The other big part of this is the overtime rate type is hard-coded in the system, and unfortunately, we cannot remove it. So I know it's tempting. You see it on your drop-down list. You see it says overtime there, and gosh, you really want to pay the employee overtime. Stay away from overtime. Bottom line from this slide, stay away from overtime. Now, as an alternative, we have a rate type, and that rate type that I urge you to use is a rate type called OT Move. Now, OT Move takes the place of overtime and allows you to actually guarantee that the employee gets paid time and a half for those associated number of hours worked. So if you need to, quote unquote, force overtime to an employee's time record, those hours that you code as OT Move will be treated as overtime. They'll be paid at time and a half. Now, in this scenario, and in obviously for those who have been doing it wrong in the past, the thing I want to point to your attention is a danger that is looming out there when you do try to code time to an employee's time to OT Move. Now, there are some locations around the country that kind of treat overtime almost as a incentive, in which an employee is asked to stay late or work, and they'll be paid time and a half for that time, although they did not earn overtime at the end of the week. So basically, they didn't hit that overtime rule to garnish enough time for overtime, true overtime. So keep in mind that in those scenarios, if you still mark your time as OT Move, that system is still going to move that time for you and treat it as overtime nevertheless. So keep that in mind, because let's say an employee starts the work week on Saturday, Sunday, and works at a alternate job B, let's say. So they work at job B. They work 4 hours each of those jobs. 4 hours at that job each day, Saturday and Sunday. But you want that to be treated as overtime, because you know that he can't have that time the normal hours that he works Monday to Friday on that job be treated as overtime, because he can't afford overtime. He's going to work 40 hours there, we know that. So we always have to make those weekend hours overtime. You can go in there on Saturday and Sunday and put in those hours as OT Move, and the system will pay it at time and a half. But keep in mind, let's say if that employee works Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and let's say Thursday as well, at 8 hours, is full shift as a day porter at those jobs, he's going to earn 32 hours of regular time for those Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, with Saturday and Sunday as OT Move, which is getting paid at time and a half. But let's say he calls in on Friday, says he calls in sick. He does not get enough hours to actually have true overtime. In that case, what's going to happen is you're going to have kind of a weird anomaly on your timesheet, because you're going to have 32 hours of regular time plus 8 hours of overtime for that Saturday, Sunday work, because you marked it as OT Move. Now, in those cases, the company kind of frowns on that, because we're paying overtime for an employee who just simply worked 40 hours, and in this case, at a 40-hour work week, OT rule did not get met, so you should not get paid overtime. And that is kind of where everyone should understand. That's kind of where the concern is being brought up by your management team, etc., whenever we see scenarios like that. Now, we do understand that sometimes OT Move is used for kind of incentive, and that those scenarios, it's not really including those in this particular scenario. But just keep in mind that OT Move and kind of forcing overtime can lead to a bigger danger. And that danger, obviously, like I said, is just keeping in mind that the rate type is going to drive that overtime, or not how that employee gets paid. So only use that rate type when you know that employee has earned OT. And if you prematurely change that rate type and the employee does not meet that overtime criteria, keep in mind that the employee is still going to get paid time and a half for that forced overtime, because we're kind of forcing it. So once again, employee works 20 hours at regular, 8 hours at OT Move. That becomes a big telltale sign. Now, the dashboard reporting will provide additional detail. If you ever drill down to the timesheet view in the monthly labor forecast or any of the ePay compliance dashboards, and you drill down to that timesheet view, you'll be able to see, and the system will actually pinpoint and highlight the different pay situations, and all the overtime situations will be there in bold for you, so you can quickly notice and keep track of your overtime. So keep that in mind. Only force the overtime when you truly know that time is going to be time and a half. And the question always becomes is, how do I force it? If I wanted to use OT move or stop using overtime and use that OT move, well, it's very simple. You go back to the time card view. On the time card view, you go into edit that time card, and that's shown in a section on bullet 1 there. So on bullet 1 there, you go in and essentially just click on the line you want to edit. Come up to the top, click on edit, select the time cards. Once you do that, you'll be taken to this big window down here at the bottom of the screen, to which point then you can then change the job if you have to. You can change a task if you really need to. But more times than not, all you're going to do is come in here and move that out, the hours worked, to OT move. Come over to the far right-hand side, and it's cut off a little bit on the end of the screen there, but go in there and you pick correct codes because you're only correcting the rate type in this case. And then you go down to the very last step on the very far left. Now click on Save. Typically at this point, you'll be prompted with a little green dot. And the little green dot appears actually right to the left of the employee name, where I'm trying to do a little scribble right now. And if you get a green dot, you're great. If you get a red dot, hover your little arrow on top of that red dot, and it'll actually tell you what is missing or what did you forget. More times than not, we forget that reason code. That's why I want to make sure you remember to do that. And then hit save again, and obviously it'll turn green, and then you're done. It saves your entry. Very quick move to go in there, and a very quick thing to do, change a rate type from regular to OT move. Now, when you change a rate type like that, it doesn't affect your manual entry score because it's not a manual entry, because if you're not manually entering anything, everything's already there. It's not going to affect your time change because you're not affecting the actual total time the employee worked or messing with the punches. It won't affect your invalid punches. It won't affect, only thing really at bottom line what's going to affect and possibly is your correction lag, because the corrections, we want to make sure that you have those corrections within a 36-hour time frame. But once again, if this is not if it's just like a one-off, an exception, not the actual norm, then it won't affect your correction lag all that bad. But once again, let's make sure that if you need that time to be shown as overtime, notice on the drop-down down below, you see overtime up here at the top of the list. That's the one we want to stay away from. Stay away like you never saw it. Make sure you use OT move instead. So that is your forcing overtime. Now keep in mind, for all those that actually use this force overtime as OT move, the system, if you look at the timesheet view, is going to show OT move as your rate type for 8 hours, like it shows there. It will not show overtime there. Just so you know, it'll always show OT move. Now, if you let the system kind of go through and calculate time on its own, so going back to that scenario, that employee worked a non-default job on Saturday and Sunday and worked 4 hours each day on Saturday and Sunday, then came back and worked his normal day porter job, 8 hours Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. In that scenario, if we let the system just control it straight based on the OT rule, that scenario alone would mean that after Thursday's time, then when the employee actually worked 40 hours, hit the 40-hour mark, that's when the OT would actually kick in, and those last 8 hours that he worked on Friday would all become overtime. However, we in Blueforce have kind of circumvented that normal way of thinking for the system. And what we've done is there is a setting in the system called priority overtime. Now, priority overtime works this way. If the employee works on a non-default job, the system will automatically give priority to non-default jobs when calculating overtime first. What that basically means is this system setting that we have set up right now at the pay group level, another good reason why the pay group needs to be correct on that employee record. On the pay group level, we've set up this setting that says if an employee works a non-default job, let's give the priority when calculating overtime. Priority goes to those non-default jobs first, and then the normal job. So in that scenario that I talked about, where the employee came in on Saturday and Sunday to work on their non-default job, and then went to their default job on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday to work, the system's going to say, wait a minute, I see he's worked 48 hours. I need to apply 8 hours of overtime. Oh, the setting here that's set up on the pay group tells me to go ahead and treat that Saturday and Sunday with the overtime first, and then any leftover overtime would be applied to the normal job. But in this case, there's no overtime left over, so the normal job would get 40 hours. That extra job that employee worked at the beginning of the week will be given that priority of getting the overtime first. That priority setting is automatically set up in there. So for the example of this time card, you'll see that the employee actually punched in and out as instructed, and he actually worked some additional work via work order that was actually labeled there. You'll see there those three different work orders. And that was for the pay week, and he did it on the 16th, 17th, and 18th of April. Well, that's pretty good. The employee actually punched in and punched out like we wanted him to. And they actually noticed that there are some non-default jobs involved. In this case, the main job is the My Main Office, but the non-default job is the Alamo Cafe job that's listed here. So in reviewing the employee's timesheet, you can now see that the overtime rules were calculated automatically based on that priority. You'll actually see that also the OT rule for over 40 hours in a work week was applied. And you can see that for the pay group setting, the OT that was earned during that work week, those 8 hours that he actually worked on that overtime, the extra job, was applied first to that employee's non-default job, like we wanted it to. That means that the employee's default job in his or her Blueforce profile will then take the precedence. So keep that in mind, that as you go through here, is that if you have any employees working a non-default job, the system will automatically apply the overtime there first, and then apply it to their normal default job. And that's kind of the setting we have in there, because more times than not, the default job is where the employee works a contractual job where more times than not, we can't afford to budge on what we're spending there at that job site. Now, it's going to happen eventually. Obviously, we understand we have to cover other people's slots and whatnot, but this is an option that to keep in mind as we deal with that absenteeism, I guess you can say, at some other jobs. Now, another thing that I won't talk about today, and I'll just briefly mention, is this concept of A/B time. It's a bigger and bigger concept, and I think that's something that we'll be talking in the very, very near future on an upcoming webinar. But A/B time is a concept where you essentially add time to an employee's give time to an employee for essentially covering someone else's or assisting with another person's shift without having them work extra. So, for example, it's a 6 to 10 shift. You have 3 employees working a 3-floor building. Each has their own floor. However, let's say the person who cleans floor 3 is not here today, and so you make an agreement with the other 2 employees to kind of bust their butts a little bit harder, go through and clean their floors, and then go ahead and also clean that 3rd floor during their same normal 4-hour shift. And as incentive, you're going to pay them an extra hour of time. So typically in that, instead of going in there and editing the in-or-out punch to add an extra hour of time, because we can't do that, we simply change a rate type to something called A/B time, in which A/B time just basically adds the given amount of hours to that employee's total time. So that's something that's a concept that may help a little bit with this, kind of be indirectly related to this overtime kind of concept of priority overtime. But that's something that the company as a whole is looking at starting to do, and like I said, it will probably be a topic in an upcoming webinar here in the next upcoming few weeks. So as to kind of wrap up today's call, as I always do, I want to make point of support. If you have any questions, concerns on anything you saw today, please enter a help desk ticket, and either myself, Tiandra, Beth, or Jade would reach out to you. And we ask you to always do this via the help desk, because we want to make sure that none of the requests from any of our users get stuck in someone's email or voicemail box and sit there unattended to. Now, I want to say thank you for joining us for this week's ePay Mastering Blueforce, the weekly series webinar. We'll have another topic and another series of webinars next Tuesday and Thursday, starting at 2 p.m. Central again. So hope you can join us next week as well. So until then, have a great rest of your work week, and happy spring break for those that are out there on spring break, and we'll catch you again next week. Thank you all.